today we're going to be talking about self-editing checklists. Now, obviously, everyone's self-editing checklist is going to look a little different depending on genre, age group, your specific struggles, etc., etc. But these are some things that you might want to consider, might want to highly consider having in your self-editing checklist. These are generally good things to have on your self-editing checklist, no matter who you are and what age category you're doing. So as a result, hopefully you'll find these things helpful. Alright. First off is filler words. These are words that are kind of like the English language's but, things that even though people actually say them in context, you don't want to use them all the time or use them too much. You might want to think of using something else to make your prose stronger. Great examples of filler words. I'm just going to give you the top ones that I found when Googling and that I've experienced when editing. Actually, basically, seriously, I guess, or I suppose, just, very, really, highly, totally, simply, something like that. Kind of, sort of, seems like, etc., most, somehow, due to, slightly, empty out, absolutely, literally, certainly, I think so, I believe so, personally, quite, perhaps, so, in fact, I already said perhaps, completely, somewhat, however, utterly, then, okay, well, now, still. And those are just some of them. Not all of them, but those are actually all ones that either I struggle with, I've seen other people struggle with, or Google said that other people struggle with even though I haven't seen them or experienced them. It doesn't mean they don't exist. The reason why you want to get rid of these words is because it's going to make your prose more powerful. Now, do you have to get rid of all of them? No. I would highly recommend, though, doing a Control F and then Googling the word within your document, or rather, finding the word within your document, and then go through each and every one, read the whole sentence, see if you can delete it or replace it with another word, and if it is better to delete or replace with another word, then do it. If you feel that the sentence cannot survive without it, or alternatively cannot have a replacement word because it wouldn't have the same value, or that's just part of the character's voice, whatever, then keep it. But I would highly recommend at least going through it, because there are a lot of people who don't even realize how often they use certain words and until they Google it, Control find it, and all of a sudden they see it everywhere, and well, it's kind of intense sometimes. And the next thing is redundancy. So this is when you describe something and then you describe it in a slightly different way, or you use a word that is so similar that you might as well just use one or the other. It would be kind of like saying, she softly and quietly went down the stairs, and it's like softly implies quietly, so you could just keep softly and you don't have to do softly and quietly. Or if you say they were handsome and good looking, pick one, handsome or good looking. Or alternatively, if you have a word that you repeat a lot within a specific section, so not even just repeat a lot like the filler words before, but even if you just say like their papery skin against the papery background, against the paper white, too many uses of the word paper, come up with something else. It might help your prose to feel a little bit more popping off the page and feel better. Repeating things is not bad. However, be careful of doing so. Do so deliberately. Like, for example, if they wanted to say, it shouldn't have happened, it shouldn't have been real, it shouldn't be what's happening. Like, those are all very redundant, but if the person is spiraling or having like a panic attack, absolutely, I could see them being redundant and having it be kind of poetically repeated like that. Or alternatively, you could do something like the stars shone like gems, stars shone in spite of the cruelty of the world, the stars shone, and yet they were millions of miles away. Like, that makes it feel poetic as well, so you can use it for a poetic reason, but generally only do 3 if you're doing that, and do 3. Don't do 2, because 2 feels redundant, 3 feels purposeful. So generally if you're doing a purposeful repeating, do 3. And only do the beginning of the sentence. Don't do the entire sentence. All right, another thing that you should probably look out for, almost everyone has one of these two struggles, or both, is white room syndrome and blob character syndrome. White room syndrome is when you don't describe a place until about halfway through the scene, or you don't describe it at all. Some people don't describe it at all. There are other people, though, who say there's a bunch of dialogue, they're outside, and then all of a sudden they're like in a forest, and you're like, wait, I thought they were like in a meadow, because you didn't describe it beforehand. Just saying they're outside is not enough. You need to say the leaves fluttered down, or the smell of roses permeated the air. Something to give us context clues before just being like, it's a forest, because otherwise that's going to cause your readers to be pulled out of the story because of white room syndrome. Alternatively, if you don't describe it at all, and you don't even say if we're outside or inside or anything like that, or just say inside a house, what room in the house, what furniture is there, what does the house look like? Like, these are things people want to experience because they want to be immersed in your story, and it's hard to feel immersed if we don't know where we are. Another thing you might want to look into is blob character syndrome. With blob character syndrome, you want to make sure that you are describing your characters and describing them up front. If they're a side character, it's okay to just say one or two small details or even no details if it's a side character. However, even then, most people prefer at least one detail. Like, if you say she was a mousy looking girl, that's enough for a side character. Especially if they're a side character that like appears for a second and then like disappears, or like dates the character for 2 chapters and then leaves. That's totally fine. But if you have blob character syndrome for like your main character, for instance, that's going to be a problem. And I know that some people argue that with non-binary people you should respect their lack of having gender, but you can still describe someone without using gendered terms. You don't have to gender hair color. You don't have to gender eye color. You don't even have to gender body shape. There are curvy men and curvy women. There are skinny men and skinny women. There are every body shape of every gender. So as a result, you don't really have to suggest gender by describing people. So I wanted to clarify that. With blob character syndrome, it's also important to make sure that you don't clarify it too late. Generally, if you're introducing a character, you want to make sure that all the details about what that character looks like are introduced within the first 3 paragraphs of their being put in the script. Because of the fact that if you are telling us they have red hair 5 chapters in after introducing them, the character is going to feel different, and maybe they didn't imagine them that way, and so the reader is going to be pulled out of the story. You don't want to pull your readers out of the story, obviously. So I highly recommend doing it within the first 3 paragraphs, because that's going to be the least disruptive for your audience. Next is show, don't tell. Or if you're going to tactfully tell, which is where you partially show, partially tell, make sure that the way that you're telling is in a very animated and narrative heavy way. A great example of this is Jane Austen, where she'll do a lot of like, she was a simple girl, or, you know, a man must be in need of a wife. You know, the way she narrated was very like Regency, very prim, very proper, sounded very fancy. It made it so you were engaging even if it was just narrative. However, she does use some showing, because if you just tell with narrative, it still gets boring. You need showing and telling. However, I would highly recommend, in general, if you're doing fantasy, to show and not tell. Can you tactfully tell in fantasy? Yes. But is it going to be harder to reach the expected word count? Also yes, unfortunately. And not that doesn't mean you can't get published with an unexpected word count. Just know that means it's going to be harder. For example, Brandon Sanderson mentioned that he wrote 300,000 word novels when he started. And he realized that even for epic fantasy, that was big. And so he knew that he needed to really get his prose nailed down to perfection. Because if he tried to query a novel that was half-baked in 300,000 words, he was going to get rejected. The only way you can get acceptances with a novel that is under or over a certain word count is by having absolutely the crispest, cleanest, most beautiful book. And even then, it's still going to need more editing, but you do what you can to make it as crisp and clean as possible so you can get accepted, and then they can deal with the other issues. The next thing is make sure that your world building is properly elaborated on, whether it's contemporary or fantasy. This is important. Because even if you're setting it in a setting that we are familiar with, like Washington, D.C., if we haven't been to Washington, D.C. as the reader, it's important that you elaborate on the type of world they're in. And if they're working a different job than we are, it's important that you elaborate what that job is like. If they're a police officer, I've never been a police officer. I don't know how to be a police officer. I need you to world build for me and show me what that world is like. This is not just exclusive to fantasy builders. Next, I would say map out your world building and inspect it for holes. If it's a real thing, fact check all of your stuff. If it's a fake thing, make sure that you map out your magic system, you map out your map, you map out the way that certain terminologies work. You make sure that you don't change spellings or change terminologies halfway through. You make sure that it's all concrete and consistent. Alright, last two things. As I mentioned before, look at your word count. What is the typical word count for your age range and genre? You absolutely can get published being over or under the certain word count that people expect for your age range and genre, excuse me. But it is going to be a lot harder. Like I said, you got to make sure you have even more to prove. You got to make sure you're absolutely polished. You can't bring in a half-baked, shorter or longer novel. It has to be fully prepped, fully, like if we're using the cake analogy, if someone brought me a huge cake but it was half-baked, I wouldn't like it. If someone brought me a teeny tiny cupcake but it was half-baked, I wouldn't like it. Whereas if someone brought me a teeny tiny cupcake and it had the best frosting and the coolest design on it and the best flavor and it was fully baked, I'd be like, those are awesome. Same thing with a giant cake. If it's fully frosted, fully decorated, fully baked, beautiful, I'm like, cool. But if anything's half baked, it's going to be under more scrutiny. However, if it was half baked and a regular cake, we might just say, oh, just put it back in the oven for a little longer. It's going to be under less scrutiny because it's considered normal and regular, which is the same case with word count, unfortunately. Not saying you can't, just saying it's going to be harder. Last thing is to make sure the wording is appropriate for your audience. So for example, if it's middle grade and you have kind of a dark gothic novel, that's totally cool. Just make sure you don't get too gory, you don't get too dark, you don't get too scary. You know, you gotta have some limits there. Whereas with an adult novel, you want to make sure that it's not too fluffy, because if it's too fluffy, then people don't even consider it adult. They're just like, this isn't real, this is just fantasy fluff. And yes, can things be fluffy? Absolutely. But you still gotta have some dark, you gotta have some angst, you gotta have some reality, because you're dealing with adults. That's what the audience wants. Now, that being said, can any and all of these rules be broken? Yes. Should they be? Depends on the rule. For example, having plot holes and world building that is half complete, no one likes that. Whereas like a shorter or longer word count, 100% go for it. Like I said, absolutely go for it. And then make sure the wording is appropriate for your audience. Maybe you have a middle grader who really likes gory stuff. I don't know, I don't meet middle graders who are like that, but maybe you do. But that means you're going to probably have to self-publish it. Because that expectation is going to be different. And same thing with all of these, really. It's important to remember that you can break writing rules and change writing rules, but just keep in mind certain ones are going to diminish quality, whereas others are going to be ones that you can choose. And in that case, I would highly recommend going with an editor of your choice and self-publishing if you want to break any of the major rules, just because of the fact that that is going to give you more creative liberty, more creative freedom, and more better access to an editor that is willing to work with you, because you're paying them, so they're more willing to work with you. Whereas with the editor, you're dealing with them for free, so as a result, they can tell you to do whatever the heck they want. That's the one problem with traditional publishing, is they can be very demanding because they have certain expectations and expect you to do certain things. With all of that being said, I would say all of these are really important for your self-editing checklist. The only things that I would say are on the fence, depending on what you want to do, are word count and appropriate wording. Both of those could get you rejected if you're going traditional, but if you're doing self-publishing, go for it. And even if you're doing traditional, like I said, go for it. Just make sure that you know you're going to be under higher scrutiny, so you expect to have a better, more polished product. Thank you so much for listening, and please know that we have a summer writing contest that will be finishing on July 30th. The prompt is to write a story in a library. So it has to take place in a library for at least part, if not all, of the story. You could do a sword fight in a library, you could do a haunted library, you could do, although I've heard someone's doing a sword fight in the library, so maybe be more original than that. You could do a haunted library, you could do a fantasy fairy library, like, I don't know, just have fun with it. Thanks.